The house by the lake looked like something out of a movie. Tall glass windows overlooked the shimmering surface of the water, reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. A spacious terrace with wooden railings beckoned for morning coffee, while the dense pines framing the property added a sense of seclusion. I stood on the doorstep, holding the last box in my hands, trying to believe that this was now my home. Thomas, my husband, smiled as he took the box from me. His confidence and calm demeanor always put me at ease. He was 20 years my senior, but it never felt like a gap. Rather, it was like a solid foundation I could lean on. His gray hair and slightly tanned skin gave him an elegant appearance, and his gaze, always soft, always understanding, reminded me why I had chosen him. "Welcome home," he said, opening the door. Inside, everything reflected his character. Minimalism, the warmth of wood, and impeccably chosen details. I took in the high ceilings, the designer furniture, and noticed the faint scent of fresh paint. Thomas had told me he had updated the house before my move, and now I understood how much love he had poured into that gesture. "You'll love it here," he said, setting the box down in the living room. "Chris will be here soon. He needs some time to adjust." I knew little about Chris, only that he was Thomas's son from his first marriage. We had never met before, but I'd heard bits and pieces of his story. Working in New York, a breakup with a girlfriend, moving back home. Thomas spoke about him with love, but also with concern. Chris seemed to be a complicated person. I placed a few books on a shelf, pondering how our relationship might unfold. It probably wouldn't be easy. Men like Chris, used to their independence, rarely welcome someone new into their lives. But I was determined to try. Suddenly, the sound of a door opening broke my thoughts. Standing in the doorway was Chris. Tall, with dark hair pulled into a careless ponytail. He wore a black leather jacket, jeans, and heavy boots. His appearance was a stark contrast to the house's refinement. "Hello?" he said curtly, barely glancing in my direction. His voice was low and rough. He walked past me as if I were part of the furniture and dropped his bag in the corner. An awkward tension filled the air. His gaze was sharp, almost scorching. It lingered on me for just a moment, but it was enough to stir an inexplicable unease within me. "This is Ellie," Thomas said, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "My wife." Chris nodded without a word. His silence felt like a challenge, and his expression was unreadable. I tried to smile, but he had already turned away. "Nice to meet you, Chris," I said. He responded with a brief, as if even speaking was too much effort. The atmosphere grew heavy, but Thomas, as composed as ever, continued talking about how the day had gone. I returned to unpacking my boxes, trying to distract myself, but I could still feel his eyes on me. It was as if he was observing my every move, judging, or perhaps just reflecting. That night, lying in bed next to Thomas, I stared at the ceiling for a long time. Something invisible yet heavy hung in the air. For the first time, I felt that this house wasn't just a fresh start. It was a place where I would have to face not only my own life, but also something far more complex. The next morning, I decided to tackle the remaining boxes. The living room filled with the aroma of coffee, sunlight spilled across the soft carpet, and the calm of the new house began to soothe my lingering unease. Thomas had left for the city to take care of some business, leaving Chris and me alone. This is a chance to talk, I thought, trying to maintain a positive mindset. I started arranging books on the shelves, hoping to create a cozy atmosphere. When I looked up, Chris was standing in the doorway. His arrival had been almost silent. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed over his chest, his dark eyes studying me intently. "How did you sleep?" I asked, trying to initiate a conversation. "Fine," he replied curtly. His tone was detached, but there was a tension beneath it. The awkwardness crept back in. His gaze felt heavy, as though he were trying to decipher my thoughts. I looked away and continued unpacking, but the sensation of his scrutiny didn't fade. "Are all these your books?" he asked suddenly, stepping closer. "Yes, I love to read," I answered. feeling my heartbeat quicken slightly. He was standing a bit too close for comfort. Interesting. What do you read? Romance, I'd guess? Or something heavier? His tone was strange, almost teasing, but still cold. I turned to face him, trying to discern what he meant, but his expression remained unreadable. Mostly novels, occasionally biographies, I said, deciding to ignore his sarcastic undertone. He nodded, but something flickered in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. He took a step back, as though to size me up from a different angle. Thomas is happy, he said suddenly, almost in a whisper. That's rare for him. So am I replied, his words striking a chord within me. I hope we can all get along. Chris smirked, but there was no warmth in it. It felt more like a challenge. We'll see, he said before leaving as quietly as he had appeared. I stood there in the living room, feeling a strange tension settle over me. His behavior was perplexing. Was he testing me or simply expressing his dissatisfaction with my presence? That brief exchange left a lingering unease I couldn't shake. Chris was a man whose thoughts were hard to read, but something about his coldness stayed with me. Throughout the day, I kept noticing his presence, passing by the living room, lingering in the kitchen longer than necessary. We barely spoke, but his silent observation was as loud as words. I tried convincing myself that it was all part of adapting to the new situation, but the growing sense of unease was undeniable. A week had passed, but the situation hadn't improved. Chris continued to avoid direct communication, yet his presence was felt everywhere. It seemed like he was always around, lurking in the shadow of a doorway, standing on the edge of the terrace, or sitting behind a newspaper in the kitchen. I caught glimpses of his sharp, probing glances, but whenever I turned, he masked them with indifference. One evening, while Thomas was working late, I settled into the living room with a book and a cup of tea. The house was quiet, save for the gentle crackling of the fireplace. I had hoped to finally feel comfortable in this sprawling home that still didn't quite feel like mine. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. Chris walked into the room with a glass of wine in hand. This time, he made no attempt to hide his presence. Instead, he sat down in the armchair opposite me, calmly watching as I flipped through the pages. "Do you always read like that?" he asked, breaking the silence. His voice carried an ambiguous undertone. "What do you mean?" I replied cautiously, setting the book down. With that tension, like you're expecting someone to jump out from around the corner. I smiled faintly, but his observation struck a nerve. He'd hit too close to the truth. He'd been watching me too closely, too intently to miss the unease I hadn't even admitted to myself. "I'm just trying to adjust to a new place," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. Chris raised his glass to his lips, but his gaze never left my face. A new place, a new husband, a new life. Must be a lot to handle. His words felt like a challenge, a deliberate test of my resolve. Irritation began to simmer beneath the surface. "Change is a part of life," I said, trying to steer the conversation to calmer waters. "What matters is finding the positive in it." But Chris didn't seem inclined to let it go. "Did Thomas tell you that? Or do you actually believe it?" I wasn't sure how to respond. His question was almost mocking, yet there was something deeper behind it. A hint of personal pain or resentment I couldn't understand. "You know, Chris," I began, summoning confidence. "I'm here to support Thomas, and I hope you and I can find some common ground as well." He smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was more of a smirk, one that seemed to challenge my sincerity. "I think you don't even know what you're looking for yet." His words landed like a taunt, but I refused to rise to it. I closed my book and stood up. "You might be right, but for now I'm going to bed. Good night, Chris." He didn't reply, only watched me as I left the room. I could feel his gaze following me, piercing through my back as I walked away. The conversation left a strange feeling in its wake. I tried to explain his behavior as mere aloofness or a difficult personality, but it felt like Chris was intentionally stirring tension between us. His words, his tone, and even his silences created an atmosphere that made me want to escape. Yet at the same time, I felt an inexplicable pull, a compulsion to stop and meet his gaze head on. The next morning, I felt uneasy. The house was too quiet, but it wasn't a comforting kind of quiet. Thomas was busy with meetings all day, leaving me alone with Chris. I tried to avoid unnecessary encounters, but it proved harder than I anticipated. In the kitchen, he appeared just as I decided to make breakfast. His entrance, as always, was silent. This time he seemed relaxed, but something about his demeanor betrayed a tension lurking beneath the surface. "Good morning," he said, as though testing my reaction. "Good morning," I replied, focusing on slicing fruit. Chris sat at the table, crossing his arms, silently watching me. His gaze was so intent that I accidentally nicked my finger with the knife. Dropping it onto the counter, I quickly ran my finger under cold water. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "Yes," I answered shortly, grabbing a bandage. "Just distracted." "You shouldn't be," he said, his tone carrying an odd edge that sent a chill down my spine. The rest of the day followed in the same vein. Every time I entered a room, Chris was already there, with a book, his phone, or just sitting as if waiting for something. His presence wasn't overt, but it was constant, almost oppressive. It felt like the house, which was supposed to be my refuge, had become a cage. In the evening, while I was watering the plants in the garden, I felt his gaze again. Turning, I saw Chris standing at the window. He was in the shadows, but his silhouette was clear. I pretended not to notice and carried on, trying to appear as natural as possible. Later, as I walked through the hallway, he appeared again. This time, his shoulder brushed mine as if by accident. I recoiled, feeling a strange unease churn inside me. "Sorry," he said, though his tone carried no hint of sincerity. "It's fine," I muttered, quickening my pace. He stopped and quietly added, "You're too tense, Ellie. Relax." I paused for a moment, considering how to respond. His words sounded like advice, but there was something else beneath them, something that made me want to flee. "Chris, if you have something to say, just say it," I exhaled, turning to face him. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze both scrutinizing and faintly mocking. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm just trying to figure out how you fit into this picture." I didn't reply. Irritation boiled inside me, but I couldn't let myself snap. Instead, I turned and walked away. His soft chuckle behind me felt like a needle, leaving an invisible sting in its wake. That night, I couldn't sleep. His words, his demeanor, the constant sense of his presence, all of it blended into a strange melody I couldn't silence in my mind. What was he trying to prove? That I didn't belong here? Or was it something else entirely? I lay in the darkness, listening to every creak and sigh of the house. It felt as though the house itself, with its large windows and glass walls, was watching me just as intently as Chris. The following evening, with Thomas still at work late, I decided to prepare dinner. Cooking had always been my solace, a way to find peace amid chaos. The house filled with the inviting aroma of roasted garlic, herbs, and lemon. I focused on the rhythmic process, hoping it would dissolve the strange tension that had shadowed me all day. As I was setting the table, Chris entered the kitchen. His appearance, as usual, was sudden, as if he timed his arrivals to catch me off guard. "You cook?" he asked, his tone a blend of surprise and mockery. "Yes," I replied curtly, avoiding his gaze. He stepped closer, leaning casually against the counter. "Thomas is a lucky man. I don't think his ex-wife ever cooked for him." I tensed. His comments about Thomas's past always felt like veiled jabs, as though he was deliberately trying to unsettle me. "I just want to do something nice for him," I said, placing the dish on the table. "And for me?" he asked unexpectedly, his voice dropping a notch. I froze for a moment, but quickly decided to feign ignorance. "If you're hungry, you're welcome to join," I replied, striving to keep my tone neutral. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only something unsettling and predatory. Oh, I'd love to. But Ellie, you know I'm not talking about food. I turned to face him, feeling anger rise within me. Chris, enough of these games. I don't understand what you want. He stepped forward, closing the distance between us until his presence dominated the space. I stepped back, only to find the table behind me, halting my retreat. You understand, he said quietly, his voice low and charged. You're just afraid to admit it to yourself. His words felt too close, too invasive, and I felt my resolve faltering under his intense gaze. But at that moment, the sound of the phone broke the tension. It was Thomas. I grabbed the phone quickly, relief washing over me. Ellie? I'm running late, Thomas said on the other end. Don't wait up for dinner. All right, I replied, working to keep my voice steady. See you later. When I ended the call and turned back, Chris was already seated at the table, pouring himself a glass of wine. His calm demeanor only heightened the tension in the room. Something inside me snapped. Not fear, but anger. Listen, I said, turning to him. I'm here for Thomas. I love him. And everything you're doing, it's beneath you. He looked at me over the rim of his glass, his eyes glinting as if savoring every word I spoke. Love him? He drawled, testing the words. Are you sure? I walked toward the doorway and stopped in the frame, my back stiff with frustration. I'm not discussing this with you, Chris. Stay away from me. But as I left for my room, I knew this wasn't the end. The tension between us had reached its breaking point, and I could sense that this was only the beginning of something larger, something that felt inevitable, unstoppable. I had hoped the night would bring peace, but my thoughts remained trapped in the events of the evening. Every word Chris had said, every glance he had given, replayed in my mind like a relentless whisper, refusing to let me sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to the house settle, the creak of floorboards, the scratch of tree branches against the glass. Yet, I found myself attuned to every sound, half expecting Chris to appear once more. Morning arrived just as heavily. Thomas left for Seattle for the week, and now the house belonged to just the two of us. I tried to think of ways to occupy myself, anything to avoid encountering Chris, but avoiding him seemed impossible. In the afternoon, I returned from town with groceries. As I opened the door, Chris was already there, standing in the doorway with a nonchalant smile as though he had been waiting for me. Need help? He asked, reaching for one of my bags. No thanks, I replied tersely, trying to move past him. But he grabbed one of the bags anyway, his hand brushing against mine. His touch lingered a moment too long, sending a shiver down my spine. I yanked my hand away, unsettled. Why are you always so guarded? He asked with a smirk. Only around you, I snapped without thinking. He laughed. It wasn't a laugh of amusement, but a mocking sound that only stoked my irritation further. I headed toward the kitchen, focusing on unpacking, but I could feel him lingering, his eyes following me. By evening, I decided to water the garden, one of the few activities that genuinely relaxed me. The air was warm, and the night sky glittered with stars. I tried to shake the feeling of Chris's presence, his words and gaze, but even here, amidst the calm of nature, he lingered in my mind. A faint rustling behind me made me turn. Chris had stepped out of the house, holding a glass of wine. In the dim light, his figure looked unusually at ease. Do you always enjoy watering so much? He asked, standing beside me. Yes, I replied shortly, not turning to face him. I tried to maintain distance, but I could feel him closing in. You're too tense, Ellie. Again. Why? His voice was soft, almost gentle, but it only heightened my unease. Maybe because you won't leave me alone. I snapped, spinning around to face him, watering can still in hand. What are you trying to prove? Chris lowered his glass and stepped closer. His gaze was intense, his voice quiet and almost a whisper. I'm not trying to prove anything. I just want to know why you don't believe me. Believe what? My anger flared into full-blown fury. That you can ruin what I have with Thomas? You won't, Chris. Are you sure? He asked, his words carrying the weight of a challenge. And then he did the last thing I expected. He leaned in and kissed me. For a moment I froze, stunned by his audacity. Then, snapping back to reality, I shoved him away with all my strength. "You're insane," I shouted, stepping back. But he didn't move. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, filled with emotions I couldn't decipher. "I know you feel it too," he said softly. "It's stronger than both of us." "No." I cut him off sharply, my voice trembling with anger and fear. "It's just your sick imagination. Don't ever come near me again." I turned and ran into the house, my eyes burning with tears. Once inside, I locked the door and pressed my back against it, breathing heavily. Shame, fear, and anger swirled inside me, colliding into a single overwhelming sensation. I tried to make sense of what had happened. Why, for the briefest moment, had I felt weak? Why had I allowed myself, even for a second, to feel as if there was a sliver of truth in his words? The next day, the house felt even emptier and more menacing. The events of the previous evening lingered in my mind, leaving a bitter aftertaste. I couldn't fathom how to face Chris. All I could do was avoid him at all costs until Thomas returned. But as if sensing my need to escape, Chris seemed to seek every opportunity to be near me. His behavior grew more assertive, as though the kiss had granted him permission to disregard all boundaries. He appeared in the kitchen, the living room, the terrace, always with a relaxed smile that only amplified my irritation and unease. That evening, I locked myself in my room, hoping the walls would shield me from his presence. Yet the sound of his footsteps outside my door, his brief remarks after long hours of silence, they all filled me with tension. Every small thing made me feel like a prisoner in my own home. I tried to distract myself. I turned on music, picked up a book. But the pages blurred, and the melodies felt distant and hollow. A growing sense of dread consumed me. I knew that if I didn't put an end to this, it would only get worse. Late that night, with the air heavy with the scent of nightgrass and the lake's dampness, I decided to step into the garden. The fear that had been gripping my heart gave way to a newfound resolve. I had to confront him, to say everything directly, and finally end this torturous charade. Chris found me there, as if he had known I would come. He stood under the faint glow of the moon, holding a glass of wine. His figure appeared almost spectral, but his gaze remained the same, piercing, insistent, scrutinizing. "Watering again?" he remarked sarcastically when he saw me. "Chris, stop," I said, cutting him off before he could continue. "We need to talk." He seemed surprised by the firmness in my voice, but instead of retreating, he took a step closer. "Talk about what?" he asked, his tone low and challenging. "About how you can't get last night out of your head? Or about how I was right?" "You don't understand anything." I burst out, anger finally eclipsing my fear. "This isn't your business. What happened was a mistake, and you know it." His expression softened, but that only made me more afraid. He stepped closer, and I instinctively backed away. "Mistakes happen, Ellie, but they're not supposed to feel this strong." "No," I shouted, clenching my fists. "You've got it all wrong. I have a future with Thomas, and I won't let you destroy it." He said nothing, but his eyes spoke for him. They seemed to challenge my words, testing the strength of my resolve. I held my ground as best I could, but inside, conflicting emotions waged war. Anger, shame, fear, and something else I was terrified to admit. "Leave, Chris," I finally said, my voice trembling. "Just leave." But he didn't move. His figure remained in the garden's dim light, a reminder that I still couldn't close this chapter. I returned to the house and locked the door behind me. My heart pounded furiously. I knew the night would be long, but what terrified me even more was the following day. When Thomas came back, I would have to face him, all while hiding a truth that had grown too loud to ignore. Night fell quickly, and the house was swallowed by silence. Thomas wasn't due back until tomorrow, and his absence weighed heavily on me. Anxiety pulled at my thoughts, like I was teetering on the edge of something irreversible. I needed to regain control over the situation and over myself. I stepped out into the garden, seeking solace in the warm, humid air thick with the scent of the lake. The water lapped softly in the distance, and the stars shimmered overhead. I thought Chris had stayed inside, but the sound of footsteps proved me wrong. He emerged from the shadows as though he'd known I'd be here. "Ellie," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "What are you doing here?" I asked, turning to face him. My voice was firm, but inside I was trembling. "Can't sleep. This house is strange, don't you think? It feels like it speaks more than it stays quiet." "It doesn't matter. You shouldn't be here," I said, clutching the watering can in my hands as though it might offer some sense of protection. He stepped closer, close enough for me to feel his warmth. His piercing eyes held something new, less challenge, more calm. "What does matter?" he asked. "You? Me? The thing we're trying to bury?" "Chris, stop." I tried to keep my tone steady, but my voice betrayed me. "I can't, Ellie. Don't you see? I tried to stay away, but—" He trailed off, his breathing audible now, closer. "I can't." I took a step back, but he followed. "You have to. We can't deny this anymore," he interrupted, his voice firm as though trying to convince both me and himself. Before I could respond, he leaned in and kissed me. I shoved him away, stumbling back as though surfacing from deep water, gasping for air. "You've lost your mind," I said, my voice barely a whisper, tears stinging my eyes. "This should never have happened. It can't." Chris didn't move. His face was a storm of emotions, anger, pain, and a strange flicker of hope. "Ellie, no." I cut him off sharply. "Don't. This ends now. Thomas comes back tomorrow, and you need to forget this ever happened." I turned and ran back to the house, leaving him standing in the garden. Inside, my emotions raged. Shame, anger at him, anger at myself. But most of all, fear. Fear that now everything would spiral out of control. Fear that nothing could be as it should anymore. The next morning, Thomas returned. His presence filled the house with a familiar warmth and steadiness I had been desperately craving over the past days, but I couldn't bring myself to feel comforted. The events of the previous night haunted me like a dark shadow, and every time I met Chris's gaze across the table or in the hallway, I wanted to flee. "You look tired," Thomas remarked at lunch, placing his hand gently over mine. I forced a strained smile, avoiding his eyes. "Just a few sleepless nights," I lied, acutely aware of Chris silently observing us from behind his glass of water. By evening, the tension in the house had become unbearable. Thomas was in his office, speaking on the phone, while I sat in the living room with a book, pretending to read. Each minute dragged like an hour. I knew it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled, and the harder I tried to prevent it, the more inevitable it felt. When Thomas finally emerged from his office, he found Chris and me in the middle of a quiet but charged exchange. I was standing by the window, Chris across from me. The distance between us was physical, but it felt insignificant. "What's going on here?" Thomas's voice, laced with suspicion, was louder than usual. I turned to him, feeling the blood freeze in my veins. Chris didn't move, his face calm, but his eyes betrayed an inner turmoil. "Nothing," I answered quickly, but my voice shook. "We were just talking." "Just talking?" Thomas repeated, his gaze darting between me and Chris. "Ellie, you look like you're about to faint." "I'm fine," I insisted, but he stepped closer, his expression darkening. "No, you're not," he said sharply. "Something is clearly going on. Chris?" Chris remained silent. His eyes locked onto mine, and I realized he was waiting for me to speak the truth. but instead I turned away, hot tears spilling down my cheeks. Thomas, I finally said, my voice trembling. I I have to tell you something. It's it's about Chris. Thomas's face paled, his features hardening as though bracing for a blow. Go on, he demanded. It happened once. In the garden. Chris, he... The words caught in my throat, and I could barely force them out. He kissed me. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas froze as if he couldn't process what he had just heard. His gaze shifted between me and Chris before settling on him. Is this true? He asked coldly. Chris lifted his head, meeting Thomas's eyes. Yes. The single word sliced through the air like a blade. Thomas took a step forward, his face contorted with fury. You dared? In my house? With my wife? His voice broke and he grabbed Chris by the shoulder. Thomas, stop! I cried, rushing between them. But Thomas had already shoved Chris away, as though trying to expel not only him but the very reality of what had happened. Get out of my house, he spat. Now. Chris didn't resist. He looked at me one last time, his eyes filled with emotions I couldn't decipher. And then he left without a word. When the door closed behind him, Thomas turned to me. His face was like stone, but his eyes revealed a pain that was unbearable to witness. Why didn't you tell me earlier? He asked quietly, though his words struck like a blow. I was afraid, I whispered. Afraid you wouldn't forgive me. You were right, he said, his voice turning cold. I can't trust you anymore. Those words shattered me. Thomas turned away, leaving me alone in the empty living room, where the walls seemed to scream of my betrayal. After Chris left, the house was suffused with a heavy, agonizing silence. Thomas avoided me, and his detachment was worse than any anger. He stopped asking questions, stopped even looking at me. We lived like strangers, sharing the same space but not a life. I tried to talk to him, to explain, but every word I said felt meaningless. One evening, I approached him while he sat on the terrace, gazing out at the lake. His profile was illuminated by the soft glow of the porch light, and I suddenly noticed how much he had aged in just a few days. Thomas, please hear me out, I said, trying to sound firm, though my voice wavered. He turned to me, but the warmth that had once drawn me to him was gone from his eyes. What do you want to say, Ellie? He asked, his voice weary. That you made a mistake? That it didn't matter? But it does matter. You broke my trust, and without trust, there's nothing left. I love you, I said, desperately hoping those words still meant something to him. He nodded slightly as if acknowledging the sentiment, but his gaze held a quiet finality. Love, he said softly. It's not always enough. His words left me breathless. I sank into a chair, feeling the strength drain from my body. Do you want me to leave? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He was silent for so long that I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he nodded. I think it's the right thing. For both of us. That night was my last in the house. I packed my belongings in a daze. Every item I placed in my suitcase felt like a farewell to the life I had tried so hard to build. Thomas didn't say goodbye the next morning when I left. He simply stayed on the terrace, staring at the water as if I no longer existed.